What do you do when your husband dies at just 39 years old, leaving you with two small children? You close ranks, right? And you do everything that you can to protect them from pain. But perhaps you realize that you've been trying so hard to protect them from pain that you're actually getting in their way. This is just one of the many beautiful tangents from today's conversation with the wildly curious and eminently wise Vashti Whitfield. These qualities helped to transform Vashti from a grieving widow into a highly sought after transformational facilitator and just an all round rad human. Vashti is an executive coach, a filmmaker, and a global speaker who's worked with everyone from corporate executives to people in the public eye. She was initially known to me, however, for co creating an award winning documentary called Be Here Now. It was an intimate chronicle of her late husband Andy Whitfield's battle with cancer. Years of solo parenting through grief taught Vashti profound lessons about the difference between protecting someone and actually getting in their way, and how becoming the full expression of who we are is the greatest gift that we can give ourselves. Wisdom that now guides her work, helping others to navigate their own impossible chapters. Today's conversation covers territory that many of us would maybe rather not think about: anticipatory grief, solo parenting through loss, the complexity of moving forward after tragedy, and why sometimes the most healing thing that you can do or say is, what the actual fuck is life giving me right now? Let's get to the podcast. Hi, I'm Danielle, and I'm so glad that you're here because together we're going to work through big stuff. Hello, Vashti, and welcome to Big Stuff.
Hello, lovely to be here.
It's so great to have you here. I wanted to start by sharing a story with you that you don't know about trusting yourself and backing that little inner knowing, that little intuition. We met at Liz Gilbert recently ish back in February in Sydney. I have been following you for a long time. So when I saw you, I was like, oh my God, there's Vashti. And I was like, this is my chance. If I just sit next to her, then surely we're going to be working together. And we had a bit of a chat. I was trying not to be too weird. And you had to go to the bathroom, right? And while you were gone, I got all up in my head. And I was like, she's gone to the bathroom to get away from you. Tell us what happened, Vashti.
You might have to remind me because I have very
Oh my
specific memories
God.
of that experience. So there's a few
We're
things that
apart. What do you think I'm talking about?
I
Did
remember
anything
that
like,
I remember the part about um look, help me here because I have very
okay,
distinct memories of that.
all
And
right,
one I
I'm just
am
going to spell it out. Liz Gilbert came and sat with you and worked with you and your partner. And I was like,
yes.
had I stuck with the plan to work with Vashti and not get all up in my own head about how I am somehow inferior and unworthy to sit with you and speak with you at this sort of self-development, beautiful, expansive experience. Had I not done that, then all of my dreams for that event would have come true. So, I mean, there is a level of expectation. We need to practice the art of non-attachment, which we're going to be going into. But there was also a level of like I had this desire, which I had then manifested somehow, had I stuck to the plan. So yeah, I walked away. I didn't work with you, Vashti, and I did not give Liz Gilbert her signed book. It is on my bookshelf still because one day, I believe, it's going to happen.
Well, I think that's a really wonderful story in the vein of, what we both do in our line of work and purpose. Even though Liz wonderfully opened the 2 days with the whole reframe of purpose, which I just, slightly peed myself laughing
Magic.
with. It was, but my response to that, you're sharing that story, is what I have learned is that we assume if we'd done something differently, it would have turned out a certain way. And what I hear people saying constantly is this reflection piece of, if I had done that, then that would have happened. And interestingly, because I'm sure you're going to bring it up at some point, people will often talk to me about my late husband, and they will say, it's so sad because you guys were, and they've already preempted that we would have had this like marriage and life of whatever, but we never know, right? So you never know whether Liz would have come over if you'd stayed sitting there. She probably wouldn't. Perhaps she would have, the
Totally.
universe would have given you and I the time to work alone together. But interestingly, what I will say is,
I just needed a
hilariously,
poo. The reason I left is I just needed a poo.
no, no, I didn't. I didn't. I actually, and
Oh,
in full transparency, I left because I needed to realize like what I needed from the workshop. I don't remember going to the bathroom, but for me, those kind of environments where usually I'm the facilitator, it's very strange being the participator. And it's one of those places that I can disconnect. I can move into the sort of perpetrator of looking at how I might do something. And so I really needed to just go and get present. And it's a space of being vulnerable when you move into the audience and not from the stage. So that's probably where I was, as opposed to going to the actual bathroom. But what I want to say, because this is a hilarious story, is that I had the privilege of working with this, wonderful woman who shared in the two letters that we wrote, which of course I won't share, an incredibly brutal experience of life, and an incredibly, what many might look at, horrendous time, and is there with like bearing her scars. And so sitting there with the formidable Liz Gilbert, who I just think is the most extraordinary human being, and this new person. And I don't know if you remember the exercise, but for your audience here, you had to write two letters, and you got one of the people, your partner that you're working with, to read the letter back to you that you'd written in this kind of therapeutic process. Now, when I'm in processing mode or when I'm in facilitating mode, my brain kind of has cross wires. So I forget often the way to spell when I'm in facilitating. So I often have to get an audience member to come up and write, because I literally, it just jumbles everything. Now, when I'm writing creatively, unless I have a certain pen, it literally looks like somebody's drunk 3 bottles of vodka and is like, is perhaps trying to draw the infinity sign. So I hand my journal over to bloody Liz Gilbert. So I get this extraordinary woman looking into my eyes to read back this profound letter I've written from my father or somebody in the deep work we're doing, and she can't read a fucking word of it. She's like, and she goes, Vashti, you're going to have to read this letter yourself. And then I can't read it either because I was so in the moment of writing it. So I share that story because it's all about expectations and how we imagine something to be, or a relationship, and it just brings us back to like, it is what it is and it is what it isn't.
totally. Let's move on to us. And my first awareness of the work that you do came through the documentary Be Here Now. And it came to me at a time where I was in deep grief. I had helped my father die from cancer, and I was like a couple of months into that sort of grief journey. So, in some ways, after I saw Be Here Now, I was like, maybe I watched that a little too soon, but also maybe it was just in time. You know how that works? Please tell us about your late husband, whom you just mentioned, Andy. Tell us about your story.
Well, first, I must say, it's always interesting when somebody says, tell us about your story, because this is now a part of my story. And it features quite a long time ago. And yet, the story, like any good book, becomes new chapter and then another new chapter and then another new chapter. So I will share with you the part of the story that you really generously and vulnerably shared, but I would also like bring it into the now, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So my late husband was my absolute best friend. You know, we came out to Australia in our early 20s, and um, in a wonderful combination of perhaps the hedonist, the rebel, the kind of defy everything, which was obviously just sitting on top of a lot of woundings, and this very gentle, very shy human being that was just waiting to kind of be unleashed. The collaboration of our little personalities and love for each other made some pretty extraordinary things happen. And one of those things was his move from shy engineer into an actor at age 38. And now that didn't just happen through turning up and doing things. That was through a lot of sacrifice, a lot of focus, a lot of commitment, and the ongoing support system and structure of my philosophy and a belief system, which is like, well, why not? Like, why not? Why not go for it? And so he became very briefly the man of the moment and did what everybody said wasn't possible. And back in the day before streaming it was just the beginning of, he landed himself as the lead role in this huge show. Now, what was interesting about this is that the character that he played was also a historical character. And the fact that he was like the good luck story, the Welsh boy that was a shy engineer that, became the actor that men and women wanted to shag, and animals. Anyone that saw him, they just thought he was beautiful. And he's running around in a loincloth, and he's charming and he's authentic and he's humble, all of those things. And then, just as he sort of hits the red carpet and has this lovely, authentic acknowledgement and love of the people, all of a sudden the red carpet becomes the chemo ward. And what we thought was extraordinary sword fighting and stunts and was really bad backache and perhaps a torn muscle became stage 4 cancer. And so, as we completely reframed what our situation in life was, um, a whole new chapter of life came out, which was the willingness to sort of let go of what was and embrace what is. When we found out that, in fact, his cancer had come back and they suggested it was only and solely terminal, Andy decided that we had to use who we had behind us to put some extraordinary purpose into what he was going through. And that's where we decided that he would make the documentary and we would invite cameras into our world. Because if we can't turn this into something that is of value to others, what is it all for? And so, cut to a year later, and I'm sure, spoiler alert, you realize that the outcome was not what we thought it would be, hoped it might be at the beginning of making the documentary, and what it ended up being, which is actually nearly 14 years on September 12 in Australia, 11 in America, which is also the anniversary of 9/11. So
Yeah.
Andy's life has ended, and he took his last breath on a beautiful spring day in Sydney and an evocative day in America. And out of that came the Be Here Now documentary, which, with the enormous love of our Oscar nominee director, Lilibet Foster, and Sam Maydew, and countless other people, and an enormous crowd-funded campaign, was released in 2017 and became this extraordinary documentary that was just a catalyst for not only those in the end of life space or going through, you know, the possibility of their own mortality, but the carer, like the yous that looked after their dad, the me's that tried to raise two little children whilst their father was dying, and gave a voice to so many, to the point of, still I have incredible people that have watched the documentary, sold their businesses, packed up their entire home, took their 3, now 5 children and traveled the world because they thought, what are we doing? I could die anytime. So that film, Be Here Now, the Andy Whitfield, which is available, well, there's going to be soon, finally, a new platform, but you can watch it on Canopy for anybody that wants to watch it. That just became an incredible catalyst for so many people to understand the redirection and the reframe of the concept of legacy, how we live life, but also what we leave behind.
Amazing. You mentioned the crowdfunding. I read it was one of the most successful crowdfunding campaigns ever for this kind of thing. So congratulations on that. The You talked about reframing quite a lot, and I really want to go into this because you actually say on your podcast, where, you know, whether you like it or not, everything happens for a reason, and it's up to you to find the radical reframe to mine for the gold. When you are in that, when you were in that, and I would hazard in any major, anytime you're going through the big stuff, right? Anytime you're in there, the flux moments, the challenging moments of life, sometimes like reframing in the moment can be incredibly difficult. How did you find the capacity to reframe while your husband was slipping away from you?
My belief is it's not so much that everything happens for a reason, is that everything happens for you.
Yeah.
So in the moment, often the reason is as far away as anything ever could be. So it's about the patience and the trust to recognize that the for me will come when it's supposed to, and perhaps when you're ready for it. Now, the happening to me, your dad was dying. My husband was dying of cancer, and he was in pain at night. And I was trying to raise two little people. And despite public um, opinion, we were not absolutely drowning in financial support through this process. So there were all sorts of other challenges going on, whilst we had incredible love and support around us, which I'll never take for granted. And in that space, the documentary was our medium, was our reframe, was our catalyst. It gave us this incredible way where things got too much to share it, to process it, and to almost repurpose it. So you'll see there's this scene where I'm talking to my mum in the documentary, and it's funny because I haven't thought about this for years, and I'm just crying, saying, I don't know, you know, I'm having that little moment. And then you sit down with whichever person is working in the documentary, and they'll ask you a series of questions, and you're being filmed, and my cubs, very little, are running around. And all of a sudden, the emotion turns into clarity. The vulnerability turns into not strength as in bicep yielding strength, but just like the vulnerability becomes this power in sharing it. So for us, that is what it was. But also, just from a practicality perspective, which not everyone has the luxury for, because I had, you know, one almost hanging off the boob, not quite, and a little 5-year-old, I had to go and have space by myself. So the way you asked me how I got through that and how we get through that, I would allow myself to go into the shower and sob. And this sounds a bit brutal for any of you going through something like this. I would allow myself to go into the shower, and whilst it felt disloyal and horrific, and I was fearful that I would manifest it, I would allow myself, as the person that moved into anticipatory preparation and anticipatory grief, I would allow myself to imagine his funeral. I would allow myself to think into those thoughts that I would never speak aloud because they felt like they weren't supportive. I would allow myself to go and run on the beach or when I could, and just let my feelings come to the surface, but also allow myself just for a moment to step away from the role of the carer or the mother. And that was how I traveled through that, just so you had those little moments of both purpose and clarity of distance.
My mum is, she's just been granted voluntary assisted death. She's got MS. She's had MS since I was 13. And we are approaching her death in a really interesting way. She's got maybe 5 months. She wants to die in January. And even though this is something that has been on our radar for 1,000 years, we've really started talking about assisted dying when I was about 18. We're coming down to this sort of pointy end of it. And how do we, how does she live well in the last 5 months, knowing that she's got, you know, limited mobility and she's got limited energy? And also, how do I prepare as her daughter to say goodbye? And we've got, you know, some great things coming up. We've got a living wake. We're going to go see Gaga. We've got like cool things. And then I know that there is this day that we're going to do this thing. And when I think about, I'm really busy in the doing of getting ready for mum right now. I'm organizing the party, and I'm trying to get us like some kind of a VIP experience at Gaga. Like, so I'm really in the doing right now. But when I think about the feeling of the experience of the day, that's when I get really overwhelmed with the feels, right? And that is the preparatory stuff. Because we can get so caught up in the doing to almost outrun the emotions.
Mm.
So just hearing you sort of talk about that, allowing yourself to imagine the thing that we're fearing.
I don't want to interrupt you because I can feel that, it's a very poignant, and it's, like everything with death that is not sudden has this lead up of both potentially beautiful and brutal, and I describe grief, because what we're talking about is part of it is grief, as you'll hear me often talk about it, which it really challenges some people as this extraordinary twin pair of like, it's grief and growth, it's beautiful and it's brutal, because it is
Yeah.
the most extreme of the human experience, as is birth. And what I want to say is, I want to share this a few different things. One, it's very interesting to me while you talk about the day, which is actually the dying, the passing. And so there's almost a resistance and an avoidance of it. It might not be a day, it might be a night, it might be a morning, it might be whatever.
Mm.
And it's almost like you're going into anticipatory preparation so that you call it a day. So you remember the day, the birthday, the death day. And my invitation is always do what works for you. And the more we can welcome in, because you're talking about which I don't necessarily agree with what you're saying, is the avoidance of, by in the doing, you're avoiding the feels, you said. But I also think we can begin to prepare by saying it for what it is, for preparing for her death and preparing for her dying, because dying can take days. Like, you said your mum's been had her illness since, 13 or
Oh, she's been
15.
dying for years. Yeah, she's been dying for
Right.
years.
But what you'll realize is there is a dying, and
Yeah.
dying can be. So for me, my experience was dying took 3 days, and the body breaking down. This is a little bit graphic, so I want to be mindful of your audience. And then there is the death, and it can be the most beautiful experience. And I feel grateful for anybody that has the chance, and I say this with absolute care and acknowledgement of anyone listening, to hold space for what is called a good death. It's a strange
Yeah.
description because good's such a non-plus word, but to allow your mum and you all to hold space for a good death, because the coming in, the birth, and the going out are of equal importance. And I want to acknowledge
100%.
what you've set up. And the other
Mm.
thing I want to say with that is, what I want to acknowledge is this really important balance, because what I see so much with the people I work with is their grief of the person dying, not just about the person. How will I be without them? What will my life? How will I cope? There's many stages, and when I talk about stages, I don't mean the stages of grief. There's layers of it. It's about them. It's about me. It's all of those. And so I want to acknowledge you, my darling, because actually, in the doing, you are celebrating the life now. We can take those moments to go through the what will that actually feel like, and allow yourself to feel that anticipatory grief. But so many people miss the time you have left in the sadness and the pain. Now, I'm not suggesting hide that, but a lot of the work I do when I work with people,
It's
and
the
again,
duality, right? It's the
it's
duality.
it's a duality, but also it's about create the space for the
Mm.
doing, and then also allow yourself. But not everybody can go there until you're there. It's a
Yeah.
very personal journey.
So the death with the voluntary assisted dying, it's quite different because it's quite sudden. She's going to be ultimately as well, more or less, as she is today. So it happens quite suddenly. It's interesting that you verbalize it as dying, as death. My father was the same. He's like, don't ever say pass away. Don't ever say that I've gone somewhere. Don't ever say any of that. I'm dead. I'm dying. I'm dead. And then I'm gone. My mum, however, we're calling it moving day because we have been
Lovely.
doing, yeah, we've been doing a lot of deep diving into consciousness and really. expanding our awareness of that energetic shift of leaving this plane, Earth School, as our friend Liz calls it, leaving Earth School and going to whatever is next. So we've been calling it moving day, but we are in no denial that, you know, it's death. She's dying. There's no doubt about that. But as you say, she's been dying for many, many years. And this
And we all
is,
are, just to be really
yeah,
clear.
well, this is the thing. I've got this book, A Year to Live, right here, researching my next project. And we are all dying and understanding how we can be living. And I think that be here now, everything that you talk about, be here now, have your legacy moments in the now, be really present. And I just love your philosophy of how to just really, you know, be here and be in your present experience. Um, after after Andy died, talk us through the part where you go from that sort of raw space into the catalyst towards something else, making this, because it's almost become your purpose, your meaningful work is around presence and catalyzing tough stuff and challenge and whatever. How did you get from the grief space, solo parent, in the mess, in the big stuff? How did you get from there to catalyzing it into your legacy work?
I think it's interesting. A colleague of mine watched the documentary, and bearing in mind the documentary came out and was screened all around the world, and it was on
Mm.
Netflix for years, and then the whole world of documentary making and docuseries, it totally changed. And so it wasn't available for quite a wee while. And a colleague of mine was able to watch it. And they said to me, "Oh," and I'd asked them to watch it because I was going to be doing some work. So I really wanted them to like speed track getting to know me, because it's an interesting one. When people watch a documentary, they'll often come up and they are suddenly thrown into a state of grief, which is long since past for me. And so they will come up with that level of intimacy as if they know you very well, and so I have to be very mindful of that. So I had asked my colleague to watch this, um, and she said to me after, it was quite interesting because I thought she'd be kind of, as people often are, a little bit vulnerable. It brings up things for them about their own experiences. And she just looked at me really kind of with her arms crossed, and she just sort of said, I mean, the thing that really stood out for me more than anything was like, I thought you were the way you are because of what happened to you. And I actually realized that this is just who you were. Like, this is who you were as a little person. There's this curiosity about whatever it is, whether it's standing in Nepal, being a scruffy little home haircut, barefoot blonde girl with your friend in Nepal who is 6 and is carrying her 2-year-old brother all day on her back, and just like being fascinated and just leaning into whatever the environment is and finding a connection in that place. So for me, it's always been about human connection, connection with nature. Now, along the way, I've lost connection, as we all have in different places where we've aspired to be something or thought we had to be something or tried to fit in, or, all the things that you started this podcast episode with. But what happened for me, and notice my choice of language there, what happened for me was through Andy's death, through suddenly becoming responsible, which would never have chosen to be, by the way, was a solo parent. Um, I would never, that to me, it was only about, I never even thought about kids until I met Andy and wanted to create these little humans with him. Finding myself suddenly in these extraordinary places, just like the reason that we decided to make the documentary. This is happening to us, and this is happening for us because there has to be something in there. And so for me, I'm like, the perfect example is if I read a really good book, I have this terrible habit of like getting halfway through, and before I've finished it, I've given it to somebody else because I want them to share the experience too. And I remember somebody saying to me before social media became so huge, and I was using it as a catalyst for sharing mine and the Cubs' lives before it was quite so, you know, ravenous as it is now. And
Insidious, yeah.
yeah, and someone said, "Why do you feel the need to share that?" And it's like, because it's too gorgeous not to. I live in Australia and I see fresh hibiscus, and I'm from England. I dreamt about this, So there is a part for me where I just found myself at a new intersection in life where it was so brutal and so painful, excuse me, but at the same time, so beautiful and so broken and so tender. And what it is to share with your little 5-year-old something and to realize that they didn't know they were allowed to miss their dad. You don't just hold that in. For me, it's about how can I repackage this and repurpose this and give it, whether it's through writing, photography, facilitating, grief mentoring, executive coaching. It's all the same shit.
Helping people to live more beautiful lives, I think, is, I mean, that's what I'm about, and I know that that's what you're about, and it doesn't matter who that person is or what they're doing. I think, like, I talk a lot about holistic success, and it doesn't matter if you're in leadership, it doesn't matter if you're in the C-suite, it doesn't matter where you're at, how high, how successful, how much money, none of that matters if it doesn't feel good to live your life. So
But
I,
and I don't, to me, it's not about the feeling good. It's about the alignment of, are you actually living in a way that allows you to connect with everything that life is offering up? And often
yeah,
that doesn't feel good. It can feel deeply painful, but we're so busy avoiding feeling certain feelings. And so, just what you said there about your work and cultivating what it means for anyone to live and lead holistic success. For me, it's about also being strategic. I had to provide for two cubs. I had to fix up and clean up a lot of stuff that, took place during my husband's illness and manage a lot of tax affairs whilst going through, the absolute bowel of grief until I found the heart of grief. And so also within that, there are these other births and deaths that are taking place along the way. And so, becoming the idea of somebody that could run a business and be available to her children 100% because I wasn't about to orphan them. So I had a very particular way of choosing to parent. Finding a way of doing the work that's honorable to who you are and aligns with who you are and makes the difference you want was another new beginning. But in that, simultaneously, and I perhaps you can relate to this, and maybe you can't, I also lost sides of myself along the way because in order to do some of those things, I felt that I needed to drop a side of myself, many sides of myself, the creative little hippie girl that wants to write poetry and or focus on creativity. And so going back to your original question was like, how do you turn that into something that becomes your legacy? For me, it was about also, and this is a strange word to use when we are talking about such profound and poignant things. It was also about being aware and strategic and committed to what is of purpose to you and what honors not only your legacy, but your husband, your past dead husband's legacy, and who you want to show up as being for your kids. And so it was like a jigsaw puzzle, Danielle. It was like, okay, I need this piece, there's this piece. And I can honestly say, as my son is now 20 and my daughter's just finishing off high school in the next 6 weeks, and I find myself at this just sort of delicious, slightly saggy, but very, very, very like unapologetic 52 years of life, that I can suddenly see now what it means to really honor his life, my life, and the work I want to do for others. And that is about how to embrace all of you, the broken, the bold, the beautiful, the slightly bonkers, and to turn
yeah.
that into something that honors what's most important to you. And for me, that is all about the human experience, all elements of it.
Wow. That makes me want to do a cartwheel, Vashti Whitfield. If my old hips weren't so sore, I'd do a cartwheel right now. Yes, I love that. Embracing all of who we are. So great. And you know, you slid into my DMs recently after I shared on Instagram that I had been trying to teach my son a lesson because he was constantly missing. He was missing the bus. He was late for school, and he was always wanting a lift. And this one particular day, I decided to put my foot down and not enable him anymore to be bad with time, which he has clearly also inherited from me. So the apple hasn't fallen far from the tree. But this particular day, I put my foot down. I was like, no, you have to run for the train. And he just made it. But once he got there, he realized his wallet had fallen out of his pocket. And he went to get on the train. Then he didn't have his ticket. And then he was so late for school. And everything about it was a total clusterfuck. And then I ended up still walking the paths and trying to find his wallet. And I did a little story on Instagram about that morning, and you wrote in my DMs, which I just loved so much, that life is a constant invitation to practice the art of non-attachment, and of course to stop as many times as needed and look at the sky and say, what the actual fuck? I mean, that pretty much has summed up parenting for me for the last maybe 12 months. I'm having my ass handed to me as a parent of young teens at the moment. How how have you managed throughout the time to continue to show up in this sort of curious way, practicing non-attachment, holding your what the fucks in the duality of what is, because there's always going to be both. How have you continued to show up and do that and not go mad? There you go. That's my question. Parenting is hard. Solo parenting I did for 6 years. That's really hard. I'm not solo parenting now, but it's a blended family, so it's got nuanced difficulties. How have you done it?
Well, I think the practicing the art of non-attachment and allowing yourself at any given time to throw your hands in the air and say what the actual fuck is life. You know, it's not just parenting, it's life. And for me, what the actual fuck is the this is happening for me. So what is the for? And this is happening for us. You know, what is that? And in terms of parenting, you know, there is no getting it right, but there is also this piece around being really clear about what the intention is behind and where you're coming from. And what I would say is that I haven't, in using your language, have my had my ass handed to me, and I've been incredibly privileged with sometimes, and this is a strange thing I'm about to say, the simplicity of being a solo parent. I am not saying it's easy in any shape or form, just to be clear, as I would never describe birth as easy. But there is something sometimes there's a simplification because there's just one of you in how you hold space, how you teach. Now that can also work the other way,
Of course.
because there is just one of you. What's been there for me, and I'm going to share a very distinct story that some people have probably heard before, but if you're hearing it again, perhaps it's meant for you. I remember being at one of the screenings, and I did a Q&A after the screenings. And somebody asked me, they said, what have you learned from this whole experience? Like, what's been the most like significant thing you've learned from it? And I thought that was really interesting. And the one thing that just came to me in that moment is, particularly through my son, what I realized is I was really trying to make up for there not being a father. You know, my anticipatory fear for them about how their life would play out. And some of the ways I chose to parent before Andy died completely the opposite to my own free range childhood, traveling the world, with bare feet, and not in a kind of expat way, in a much more the original hippie trail way. And also having parents, as much as they were wonderful, had no boundaries and enormous conflict. You could bet I was going to do everything to try and keep them safe. And of course, the universe went, no, this isn't how it's going to roll. Boom, we're going to take your husband. And so what I realized was that I was starting to try and take away their pain. I was starting to do it in all sorts of ways. So, for example, it was the Father's Day breakfast. I'd be at the Father's Day breakfast. It was soccer. I'd tear myself in two to be at her soccer match, his soccer match. I was trying to take away anything and everything that meant that they wouldn't have more pain, to the point that my son turned around to me once when he was this incredible looking little guy. He looked like kind of like a man, and strangely, he's very, very genetically similar to his dad. So he was like this handsome,
So
which sounds
it's
really creepy. But,
uncannily similar to
but
Andy, isn't he?
wonderfully, just in his early teens, he didn't shoot up. He got acne and he was this ugly little duckling. And it was the most humbling thing. And all his friends suddenly grew to 6 foot and were. And I kept saying to him every time I'd meet one of his friends, and he'd say, "Oh yeah, he's tall, or he's that," and I'd say, "But you'll be like that too, darling." And at one point, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Mum, I'm okay with being short. You don't need to worry." And it was basically this, "Mum, stop putting your stuff on us." And it was, as he always is, this wise moment. And in that moment, and I want to say this really clearly for everyone, I realized that I was getting in the way by not allowing them to experience what life meant for them. And then I would have this same conversation when they would go surfing. My son was a brilliant skater. He's now a passionate climber. My daughter's a surfer. People would say, "How can you be okay with them going out that young?" And it was like, you have to let them live. And I don't mean negligently. There's still curfews and conversations about buttons being done up on low blouses at age 13 and all sorts of conversations. But it was that point in parenting where I have to have enough awareness of what's my shit. Am I busting my ass to try and to send them to a school that I think will guarantee them a safe passageway into life? Or actually, do I take that off the table so I can spend more time with them and be okay with them going to a different school so we actually have a richer time together? It made me totally reassess being present for them and with them. So when they were disorganized, rather than getting angry, it was like, what structure needs to shift to understand that? What's going on for me that is mine and not theirs? And honestly, that's how we've got through it. Like owning my shit, I call it, as opposed to projecting it onto them. Not worrying about their future, but just doing the best to make their day and their month rich. And I've said this before, and I will say it again and again and again. And it freaks people out in some instances because it makes it sound so macabre. But, they both are very aware that their dad died at 39, just a month before his birthday of turning 40. And my son is 20. So
Yeah.
we have this conversation of, if for some reason you also got that space to be in this world, being a human. And if for some reason you only got to live to 39, why would you spend your best young years worrying about what you look like, where you fit in, which of course is, a rite of passage. And why would you spend years worrying about whether or not you're going to make the right decision in terms of your career? Because you might not get to do it anyway, or you might end up sitting in an office with Vashti bloody helping you pivot in your career because you chose a thing you don't want to do anyway. So that is how I've parented my darling, is about just always bringing it back to the now and the deepest connection and the deepest possible for possibility to really look for the learning in the moment and to avoid blame and shame like there's no tomorrow.
Yeah. And it's an ongoing process. My daughter actually said to me, she's 13, she said to me the other day, something along the lines of, "You're parenting me through your own experience. I'm not you."
Mm.
Now, naturally, I was like, "Oh, damn,
Whoa.
my 13-year-old is so wise." She hit me between the eyes with that one. But that's the trap, isn't it? Is parenting through the lens of our own experience and wanting to shield them from the things that have hurt us, when ultimately the human experience is about the richness of that duality, the highs, the lows, the tough bits, the beauty, the glory, the being short and having acne. All of that stuff is all
Yeah.
just part of being human.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's where we become. Like, we have to. Like, that is what has us become who we are. Like, for better or worse, like, I think there's this other really rich thing is I would never profess to getting it right. I don't like the language right, wrong, black, white. What I will say is also, it's like, clean up your mess. Like the other day, I have this weird attachment to my children's hair, which sounds really creepy, so I will qualify it. Like Indy just chopped off her long lion's mane. I love it when Jesse actually has short, crazy peroxide hair and he's growing it long. And I will constantly go, "Why are you growing your hair?" And they're turning around and they're like, "Mum, what I do with my hair is none of your business." And I know, I'm just being a dick. And so there's this like, there is the owning when you're being controlling, owning when you're feeling a bit, out of control. And so perhaps you're tidying up a bit too much at home, and they turn around and they tell you, like, whatever you've got going on, it's manifesting you being a control freak, and just allowing your failings, if you like, your mess to actually be discussed and viewed, because that getting it wrong is just as like profound, I really think.
Yeah, that, as you say, that's how we learn. We learn from the
Mm,
mess. We learn,
mm.
and children are such a remarkable mirror, aren't they? Don't you just love it?
Well, it's a constant holding you accountable for who you're being. That's what I find
Yeah.
it. It's yeah, like brilliant. And I can honestly say, this weekend that just passed, one of mine had driven down to see a friend, confidently 3.5 hours away. The other was off with their girlfriend for the weekend. And I found myself as an independent solo woman for 2 days, and in that moment, I can say this with my hand on my heart to you all, and this is almost, with of only few people I've shared this with. I actually came back to myself. I saw myself. I
Mm.
found myself, all the different little versions of me. The hardcore can stand there in front of thousands of people, with no top on and be unashamedly confident, or holding space for somebody in the last stages of their life, or the little woman that wants to sit there and just, or the bold woman that wants to run poetry workshops in the south of France with executives to help them find another space. And I just was like, oh, hello, you. And there is a space that I believe when we become a parent that is not lost, but can often get parked. It's almost like in who we become as the nurturer, the carer, the martyr, the provider, all those different pieces. And to find your way back to actually not being the widow, not being the mother for a moment, not being the provider, and to just be. It's very rare to have that. And if we can ever create the space to have that, that is where I think, in that clarity of distance, we remember what we're actually capable of and who we actually are, not who we've gotten stuck in the practice of being.
When you said that you had this moment and you felt like all the parts had come back to you, I felt that. I had this like
Mm,
wave, this whoosh through the center of my body that was just like relief. It was
mm,
joy, it was beauty. And I loved hearing that, because we often hear something quite different as we move into the empty nest, if you will, which does bring me to another question. I heard you say on your podcast, on an episode with, I think his name was Andy Ross, you said, and I'm taking this way out of context, so I feel like, hang on a minute, but you said, if I was to have an addiction, it would be love. And then you didn't go on to say a sex addict, but you went on to say codependency. So knowing that you have a propensity to codependency, or I don't know if you have a propensity, it's very presumptuous of me, but knowing that that's the thing that you would lean into if there was going to be an addiction, how do you get so independent?
I think, in answer to your question, I think it's probably another podcast episode, so I will answer it as richly and abundantly as I can, because it's a very broad subject. His name's Alex Ross, and
Oh,
he's
sorry,
a
Alex.
brilliant. No, no, all good. He's a brilliant human. Just so in case anybody wants to listen to the episode with him, because he's very
I'll link
brave
it
and
in the
rich
show
and raw.
notes. Mm.
So actually, what I actually believe I said was, or as you probably
Ish.
quoted it more
Yeah.
accurately than I have, what if I were then back in my earlier days to own some form of addiction? It would be probably sex addiction. And that doesn't mean that in every given moment I was trying to bonk somebody somewhere, but it would be that I looked for love consistently through
Snap.
connection.
Yeah.
And I'm talking in my younger years, pre Andy, so
Yeah,
late
same.
teens, early
Mm.
20s. And as kids, you would just play or you would, build something together. Or that was like connection, deepest connection with no bullshit, no ego. And as I grew into a young woman, all I was ever looking for was that level of connection, that playfulness. But as a sort of robust woman who's very sexual and sensual as well, then, and I had all these strapping great muscles. And what I found is I would get myself in these places of intimacy through connection. And it would be misunderstood, or I would misunderstand that I had to then follow it through with sex. And the moment it would happen, I would feel not only did I not want to be there, but I had to because I got myself into that situation. And so I would
Mm.
constantly abandon myself in pursuit of that same connection as being that little hippie kid. It was like the playfulness. So, in answer to your question, I then went into the most incredible, beautiful relationship with a man for many, 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 many years, my late husband. Now, interestingly, when he died, I found that version of her come back up. It was like, how do I connect? But because I was so vulnerable and because I had these two beautiful little cubs that I was not going to bring any kind of unpredictable energy into, I managed to kind of handle that very, very gently on the side. They were just old patterns coming up. And almost as an avoidance of being with my grief until I got to a place that recognized that that level of intimacy was not feeding what I needed. And so that's the journey that I kind of took myself on.
I relate to so much of that. And that's, as you say, that is a whole other podcast, is that abandoning yourself, looking for that connection, trying to find that self worth and the validation through the gaze of others or the touch of others. It's, I don't think you and I are alone in doing that, like wildly, in our teens and our 20s. In fact, right up until my 30s, probably.
Look,
Yeah.
but I do want to just say one thing on the terms of physicality, intimacy, sexuality, because so much of this episode has been around the conversation of grief, of death, of dying,
Mm.
of parenting, in that when we are nurturing somebody who is terminal or ongoingly very, very sick, and the intimacy shifts and changes. You might have this extraordinary closeness, but you maybe not are able to have a sexual experience. I also want to talk about post their passing, moving on, their death, whatever feels in alignment for you to term it as, which
Mm.
is always absolutely the priority and culturally very different in different environments. There is this thing where, and I see it because I do a lot of work with those in the grief space. They might come to me under the guise of needing an executive coach, but actually they're not clear how to travel through whatever kind of grief that is. It might not be the death of a person, it might be the death of a chapter of their life. And what I notice to be true is often, and perhaps it is the same with women, but they don't communicate it or perhaps don't lean into it as quickly. But for me, I found myself being naked and secretly alone quite early on. It was almost like I tried to feel something that would numb the grief and the sadness, the same thing of this person not being in my life. And not just this person, Andy, him.
Mm.
And you would find yourself with this soft human being, because I was very lucky. It wasn't some asshole and you would find yourself with this person, but it would feel so empty and meaningless. and it would bear resemblance to what you and I were talking about in our earlier years, but actually be a very different thing. So I'm bringing this, into the conversation because I also think there's a really, really important conversation to be had about our needs and what we put aside and sometimes what we fall accidentally into when we are caring for a partner, and where perhaps for years sometimes somebody has not had the opportunity to have a sexual encounter, and sometimes, and often, not always, for men it feels like an almost necessity because they don't have that intimacy amongst their relationships. So I do think in another podcast there is room for us to explore the conversation of sex and intimacy and the complexity of that in anticipatory grief, post death, and then also this whole idea of what is and isn't acceptable, because I think it's a complex beast and it's not black and white. And I've worked with so many people who have felt a betrayal or a lack of loyalty when they've sought out being in relationship very soon after their partner had died, especially men in this instance, I find. And I think it's a really important conversation to just, touch on with your audience
Mm.
today, because if you find yourself in this place where you love your partner deeply or you're grieving deeply, that you are in a quandary about how to manage intimacy, you're not alone, even though it might very
Mm.
much feel that way.
And sex and pleasure can be incredibly life affirming as well. So it's not like there is one way to do it. It's right, it's wrong. It is a complex issue, and closeness and intimacy and pleasure are also really wonderful parts of being human. So it's another
Not
podcast. I
mind.
look forward
It's
to
another
having you
podcast.
back.
It's another podcast. But also, just on that last note, it is, and it's something that took me quite a few years to understand. I think into my 40s was it's like sex and intimacy for me were about connection and being
Yeah.
loved and being close to someone and feeling enough and feeling worthy. Whereas pleasure was quite a different thing for me. I couldn't really understand or experience pleasure unless I was actually in love. And so there's also this idea that, intimacy can operate over here and sex and pleasure can operate over here. It's not, it's a gray area for so many. And I think we should perhaps run another series talking about that.
Excellent. I look forward to that. Let's, if you've got any advice for anyone who is going through big stuff right now, what would that be? Someone who's in their own what the fuck moment, perhaps, Vashti. What would you say?
I, I'm pausing because I want to answer this.
No, I've sprung it on you.
No,
Please
no,
take
no,
a
no, no.
moment.
There's three things. I'm thinking about three clients. I've got one client who has known their career like their family. They are, they come with an identity in that career. They've been in that career for 16 years, and strangely and abruptly, it has come to a close. That is big stuff. It is
Yeah.
actually the most welcome exit and entry into a necessary new chapter, but they weren't either aware enough or brave enough to take it. But for them, it feels like the end of everything. So I
Yeah.
want
It's
to
this identity
acknowledge,
shift. Yeah.
well, it's so much. It's also
Yeah.
generational, ancestral trauma. It's so much, right?
Yeah.
Now I'm bringing
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
It's not one answer. So the point is when you are going through what feels like the end, it will be loaded with grief. But to remember that, one, support, take as much support, ask for as much help, have no shame and or blame, just get in and get somebody to support you. And the second piece is that there is never an ending without a beginning. There's never a beginning without an ending. So remember that there is duality, and so it's never one thing. And what do you need, whether it's space, support, to be able to actually look at what the two of those things might look like? What is coming to an end, and how do you travel through that? But also simultaneously, what could this be as a beginning? And that's what I would say, is that, as always, eye rolling, ready, everything's happening for you. It's sure as shit is happening to you, physically, emotionally, psychologically, but the duality piece is it's happening for you. And so do whatever you need to do and be whoever you need to be to stay open to that.
Beautiful. And the only way is through, right? So we keep on going through, and then when you have the capacity, that's when you can mine for the gold, to use your term. Vashti, I've loved this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to part 2, where we dig deep on intimacy and pleasure and sex and all the juicy stuff of life. Thanks so
Thank
much for
you.
coming along
And
today.
my pleasure. Thank you.
How cool is Vashti? I knew you'd love her. It's interesting, right? In so many of the previous episodes, we've heard this similar idea, this possibility that everything is happening for us, not to us. Things are happening for a reason. But as Vashti sort of said, like, only when we're brave enough to stay open to both the brutal and the beautiful. And maybe also only when we're ready and able to step back from the emotional rawness of the experience, or perhaps step through it. What struck me really deeply was Vashti's realization that she was trying to take away her children's pain until her beautiful son said, "Mom, I'm okay. You don't need to worry." A child teaching their parent to stop projecting fears onto someone else's journey. That's pretty wow, right? That's pretty wow. A profound wisdom wrapped in everyday reality. Because we do this often. We mistake protection for love, when sometimes love means stepping back and allowing someone else to feel what it is that they need to feel, learn what they need to learn, or even fail how they need to fail. So I've got 2 thinking points to leave with you this week. First, maybe where are you trying to take away someone else's pain instead of allowing them their full human experience? Maybe it's your teenager who needs to lose their wallet and figure it out. Or maybe it's yourself. Are you avoiding the very feelings that might lead to your breakthrough, to your next evolution? And secondly, what would shift if you truly believed your current challenge is happening for you? Not toxic positivity, Vashti was very clear about that, but in a way that keeps you open to the possibility that this, what the actual fuck, this moment, it might be the exact catalyst that you need. Because as she said, there's never an ending without a beginning. The art is learning to hold both with grace, curiosity, and the occasional perfectly timed moment looking at the sky and shaking your fist, thinking, WTF. Sometimes that's the most honest prayer we can offer. Until next time, good luck in the big stuff. I hope that you enjoyed listening to this episode of Big Stuff as much as I enjoyed recording it for you. Now, if you did enjoy this episode, it would really help me if you wanted to share it with just one person that you think is going to get something out of it. And also feel free to drop a comment. All of these things really help podcasts to gain more ears, and that's what we're really here for. Also, be sure to subscribe, then you will never miss an episode. If you want to find out more about me, who I am, what I do, then you can go and check me out at daniellecolley.com.au. I'll see you next episode for more big stuff.